The morning sun spilled gold across the parade grounds at Coronado, the Pacific breeze snapping the flags that lined the perimeter. Rows of polished folding chairs stretched toward the stage, each one filled with families leaning forward, cameras clutched tight, faces glowing with pride. The brass band warmed their instruments, the sharp gleam of trumpets catching the light as the first notes carried across the crowd. It was a day of celebration, of triumph carved from pain, sweat, and relentless willpower. The graduates stood in rigid formation at the front, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their boots aligned in flawless symmetry. Months of brutal training had etched determination into every line of their posture. These were men who had endured drown-proofing, cold surf torture, and miles of punishing runs with boats on their heads. Now, at last, they stood as Navy SEALs legends in the making. The crowd buzzed with excitement, every cheer rising higher as names were called, as medals gleamed under the Sunday mothers waved small flags, fathers stood with cameras trembling in their hands. Children bounced on knees, their voices cutting through the music with bursts of laughter. Pride hung in the air like a living thing, filling lungs and hearts alike. In the middle of it all sat a woman who seemed almost invisible. Her chair was like every other, her clothes unremarkable, a plain blouse, dark slacks, a shawl draped lightly across her shoulders. Her hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back in a modest knot. She held her hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers interlocked, as if keeping something inside from breaking loose. While other parents leaned forward or clapped wildly, she remained still, her face calm, her eyes locked on one figure alone. Her son stood in the first row of graduates, his jaw set, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. He was broad-shouldered, his face tanned by months of exposure to the punishing California sun, but his eyes softened when they found her in the crowd. For just a heartbeat, he wasn't a warrior standing among warriors, he was a son, seeing the reason he had made it this far. No one else noticed her. She was just another face among the sea of families, another mother who had sacrificed nights of sleep and years of quiet worry for the boy who now wore a uniform of steel and honor. But for him, she was the anchor. Through the grind of Bud S., through the moments when his body screamed for him to quit, it had been her voice echoing in his head, her steady belief that he was stronger than the pain. The announcer's voice boomed across the grounds, listing the names of heroes and units, speaking of courage and sacrifice. Applause rolled in waves, banners snapped in the wind, and the graduates stood immovable, carved into the moment like statues. The commander paced the stage, his eyes sharp, his words commanding. The crowd hung on every syllable, yet in the quiet space between words, a mother's stillness lingered like a shadow. She was not here for the applause, not here for recognition. Her pride was silent, steady, as if she carried something heavier than the cheers could ever reach. While others clapped until their palms stung, she sat with her hands folded, her presence almost ordinary until the moment would come when the ordinary would stop the entire ceremony cold. For now, she remained unseen. For now, the only eyes that truly saw her were her son's, and that was enough. The ceremony moved forward with practiced precision, each part unfolding as though rehearsed countless times before. The band struck bold notes, the cadence of drums echoing off the concrete bleachers, punctuating every speech and every award handed down. The air was thick with pride, with the weight of accomplishment hard-earned. Families cheered when names were called, their voices breaking with joy, while the graduates remained still and straight-backed, their eyes forward, their discipline unshakable even in the face of celebration. The commander stood at the podium, his voice carrying across the courtyard with a resonance that needed no microphone. He spoke of sacrifice, of what it meant to suffer together and rise together. He spoke of cold surf pounding against flesh until it went numb, of days without sleep, of bonds forged in fire and water that no civilian could ever truly understand. His words rolled over the crowd like waves, commanding reverence, drawing nods from seasoned veterans in the stands, and tears from proud parents who now understood, at least in part, what their sons had endured. When the final words of his speech faded into the sea air, the commander stepped down from the stage. It was tradition he would walk among the families, shake their hands, and thank them for the sacrifices that had made these warriors possible. He moved with authority, every step crisp, his uniform gleaming, his medals catching the light. Parents rose eagerly as he passed, their hands extended, their gratitude spilling out in hurried words. Cameras flashed, capturing the rare moment when the commander of SEALs himself acknowledged the quiet strength behind the warriors on the field. He worked his way down the line slowly, stopping with each family, and then his eyes fell on her. She was seated as she had been the entire time, still, composed, her gaze fixed on the son who had just become a SEAL. But as the commander approached, she adjusted slightly, tugging the shawl on her shoulders against the breeze. In the movement, her sleeve slipped back just enough to reveal the ink etched into the skin of her forearm. It was old, the colors dulled by time, the lines softened by years of sun and wear, but it was unmistakable. The commander's body halted mid-stride, one boot suspended in the air longer than natural. His gaze locked onto the tattoo, and his breath caught as though the air itself had turned solid in his chest. The crowd continued, oblivious applause still peppering the air, families still murmuring, but for him, the world slowed into silence. The mark wasn't a decoration, wasn't some impulsive emblem chosen in youth. It was a sigil, a sacred one, carried only by those who had bled through a specific brotherhood of shadows. A legendary SEAL unit, spoken of with reverence and caution, a unit whose stories were told in hushed tones behind closed doors. The commander's eyes flicked to her face, searching. She did not look back at him, not yet. Her gaze was still fixed on her son, as though nothing around her had changed. But the ink told a truth that thundered louder than the band, louder than the speeches, louder than the cheering families. His jaw tightened. He had known men who carried that same tattoo, men whose names had been etched into memorial walls, men whose sacrifices were whispered about, but never written in any official record. It was a mark of missions that could not be acknowledged, of victories paid for in silence. And here it was, resting quietly on the arm of a mother who sat unnoticed in the crowd. The commander lowered his foot slowly, deliberately, his hand brushing the brim of his cover as if to steady himself. He felt the weight of history pressing on his chest, memories uncoiling like shadows. Whoever she was not just another mother in the stands. She was a piece of the Brotherhood itself, a living chapter of a story most of the world would never be allowed to read. The graduates stood unaware, their discipline holding them steady, but the commander knew he could not look away. That faded tattoo had stopped him cold, halting the ceremony as surely as if a gunshot had cracked through the air. The sound of the band seemed to die mid-note, though in truth the musicians played on for several beats before faltering, their eyes darting to the commander's sudden stillness. Families shifted in their seats, whispers rising like wind through dry grass. Something had broken the rhythm of the ceremony, something none of them could name. All they saw was the commander, a man who had stood unshaken through battles and storms, frozen in the presence of one quiet mother. He took a single step forward, then another, his boots clicking sharply against the pavement. The sound rang louder than it should have, echoing across the courtyard, pulling eyes away from the rows of graduates and toward the bleachers. Parents craned their necks, murmuring, confusion painted across their faces. Why had the commander stopped? Why was he walking toward one woman among hundreds? The graduates held their formation, still as stone, though even they could feel the shift in the air. It was as if a veil had been drawn back, revealing something immense that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. The commander's jaw was tight, his face drawn into lines of disbelief, and something deeper, something that bordered on reverence. His hand rose slowly to his cover, removing it as he closed the distance between himself and the woman in the shawl. The wind tugged at the edges of his uniform, but his eyes never wavered from her forearm, where the faded tattoo sat like a brand of fire and memory. He stopped before her, the crowd now hushed to a heavy silence. The mother looked up at him calmly, her expression steady, her spine straightened in a quiet dignity that made her seem taller than her frame allowed. The commander's voice, when it came, was low but carried across the courtyard. "Ma'am, is that—" She did not let him finish. With a small motion, she turned her arm fully, allowing the sunlight to fall on the ink, letting every detail speak for itself. Her nod was slight, but it landed like thunder. Her eyes met his without flinching, steady and sure, holding none of the uncertainty the crowd felt around them. For a heartbeat, time seemed to split. Families stared, bewildered. Graduates struggled to keep their breathing even, their minds racing with questions they dared not voice. The commander, though, understood. He had trained under legends who had spoken of others even greater, people whose records were sealed, whose names were never read aloud. And now, one of those very shadows was here, not on a memorial wall or buried in a declassified report, but sitting in the stands as a mother watching her son graduate. He straightened, every line of his body sharp, precise. Then, with deliberate gravity, he snapped to attention. His hand rose in a flawless salute, held unwaveringly as if offering it not only for her, but for every untold sacrifice bound up in the mark she carried. The courtyard seemed to exhale at once, silence spreading like a tide. The whispers died. The band lowered their instruments. The families sat frozen, their clapping hands stilled in midair. No one dared break the moment. The graduates, though trained to remain motionless, could not keep their eyes from flicking toward the scene. They saw their commander hardened, unshakable, standing in salute before a woman who until now had been invisible in the crowd. They saw respect carved into his posture, reverence in his gaze, and they understood that something extraordinary had been revealed. The mother did not smile, she did not weep. Her expression held the same quiet strength it had from the beginning, as if the weight of recognition was something she neither sought nor required. She simply inclined her head, acknowledging the salute with a composure that spoke louder than words. The courtyard remained in suspended stillness. 1,000 people watched, but only two truly stood in that moment: the commander and the woman with the tattoo. And between them stretched a bond of silence, of history, of sacrifices carved into flesh and memory. The air was thick with silence, the kind that seemed to press down on every chest and still every restless hand. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The commander's salute lingered in the open, a gesture of reverence that carried more weight than any medal pinned or speech delivered. Slowly, he lowered his hand, but his eyes stayed fixed on her, as if to anchor the truth of what he had just acknowledged. Then his voice, roughened with emotion but steady in conviction, cut through the stillness. Some warriors never fade, some battles live on in ink and blood. The words struck like a bell, ringing across the courtyard. They were not rehearsed, not part of the ceremony, but they carried the authority of lived truth. Parents clutched their children closer, graduates drew in sharp breaths, and veterans in the crowd straightened unconsciously, their own memories stirring in the wake of his declaration. The young man in the first row of graduates felt the words cleave through him, carving a space he had never fully understood until now. He had thought this day was about his own journey, the endless nights, the bone-deep exhaustion, the moments he had teetered on the edge of failure. Yet, standing in his pressed uniform, watching the commander honor his mother, he understood for the first time that his path had been paved by shoulders broader and sacrifices deeper than his own. Tears stung his eyes, but he did not let them fall. Instead, he lifted his chin, his chest rising fuller, as though the weight of her legacy had settled into his uniform, making it heavier, more sacred. His gaze found her across the rows, and though she did not smile, her eyes softened, steady as always. She had never spoken of what she carried, never told him the stories that ink and silence held. And now, when the world finally saw her, she gave it away as if it were nothing. Her lips moved, her voice barely more than breath, but it carried into every ear. This day belongs to them, not me. The humility in those words stilled the hearts of everyone present. She did not claim glory, did not step forward to take her place beside the commander. Instead, she returned the moment to the men and women who had fallen long before, to the shadows who never came home. That was her truth, her burden, and her gift. It began with one graduate, his salute crisp and unhesitating, then another, and another. Soon the entire formation had their hands raised in silent honor, their bodies still as stone, but their respect palpable. Officers followed, their arms rising in unison, until even the commander's staff joined in. The salute was not for medals, not for ceremony, not even for the living standing there. It was for her, for the woman who had carried the mark of sacrifice quietly, invisibly, until the day respect made her impossible to ignore. The crowd rose as if drawn by one breath. Parents, children, teachers, strangers, all of them stood with spines straight and hands lifted, though their gestures were imperfect, untrained. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the silence became something holy, a recognition that reached beyond rank and time. She did not rise to meet it. She remained seated, her hands folded once more in her lap, her eyes turned toward her son. For all the noise of the world, she seemed untouched, her dignity unmoved by the sudden blaze of recognition. And yet, the lesson burned into every witness, branded deeper than any speech or parade could reach. She was invisible until respect made her unforgettable.